Today, I'd like to talk a bit about and then open the floor to discuss the subject of capitalism and innovation. I'll talk about humanity's earliest innovations before the rise of class society, then how the emergence of classes affected technology before discussing the emergence of capitalism specifically and its relationship with automation and discovery. And I'll end with a brief note on what innovation might look like in a post capitalist world. To start off, we should establish some definitions for our purposes of discussion. When I say innovation, what I mean is any practical application of knowledge by people for a purpose. Given this definition, which is also a good functional definition of technology, we can see that some of the most significant innovations in human history are also some of the earliest. When we discuss indigenous societies, we often make the assumption that the colonizers were more technologically advanced, but the advancements tended to be related to metallurgy and weaponry, particularly guns. Indigenous societies in the Americas tended to far outpace their European counterparts in areas like navigation, astronomy, biology, pharmaceuticals, and most importantly, agriculture. Indigenous societies are responsible for the domestication of any number of plants that are indispensable for modern nutrition, food, and industry. Potatoes, peanuts, peppers, and pineapples all came from indigenous domestication efforts, and that's just peas. Imagine what food would look like without tomatoes, corn, or beans, just to give an idea of how drastically different our world would have to be if these innovations were never made. Now, these innovations likely took millennia of work, generations and generations of selection, not the natural selection of wild competition, but the meticulous and intentional selection by humans for the purpose of providing more sustenance and utility. They also likely relied on and fed into other innovations. For instance, without the advent of agriculture, humans wouldn't have been able to set up permanent residences or form larger social units. For the first time in humanity's history, technology had enabled the generation of a surplus, the ability for people to produce far more than they required to subsist. The surplus wasn't just in the form of excess food. Less time trying to survive meant more time to harvest wood, ore, or stone, craft tools to more easily modify the world around them, or build structures to house people or resources. Unlike food, these resources often didn't spoil over time, or at least the time frame they spoiled in could eclipse the human lifespan. How and when that surplus was handed off from one generation to the next was different between many societies. These social innovations, property rights, land ownership, and inheritance, among others, formed the basis for the emergence of class relations. When certain productive property could effectively be restricted to a select group of people, the relationships between those people and their society was fundamentally altered. We don't have time to go into an exhaustive way that class relations arose or fully detail all the effects. However, given the topic, we should discuss the effects of the emergence of class society on technology and innovation. As the distinction between emerging classes became more sharp, systems where families owned land and restricted people from using that land for subsistence without paying a tribute emerged. We generally refer to these systems as feudalism. Though the details of the form of the productive relations is highly dependent on geography, Chinese emperors are vastly different from Incan Sapas. These forms all share the characteristic of separating the people who make the decisions about fertile land from the people who work that soil. This separation is a monumental adjustment to how humanity innovates, maybe the biggest since the advent of tools. Let me give an example. In ancient China during the Three Kingdoms period, there was an engineer named Ma Jun. He was the first person in China, perhaps the world, to invent a differential, a mechanical device to allow wheels on the same axle to turn at different rates. With no connection to the Confucian scholars or credentials to impress the aristocrats, the imperial court largely saw Ma Jun's inventions as novelties, curiosities and distractions best used as entertainment or diversion. The differential, hugely useful for farmers, merchants, and in almost any engineering, disappeared for 250 years. The extensive records from the time recorded only the fact of Ma Jun's inventions and gave some detail as to their functions, but left any actual utility for the peasants and the artisans to deal with. In the words of Joseph Needham, a scholar who focuses on the history of Chinese science, quote, Majun was quite incapable of arguing with the sophisticated scholars nursed in the classical literary traditions, and in spite of the efforts of his admirers, could never attain any position of importance in the service of the state, or even the means to prove by practical test the value of the inventions which he made. The separation of the ruling class from the practical necessities of producing their lifestyle prevented them from being able to assess the importance of or adapt to new technologies. An imperial bureaucracy known for its extensive record keeping recorded only enough for us to know that a useful tool disappeared from the earth for centuries until it was reinvented by a man educated at the Imperial Nanjing University. The ruling class under capitalism is also disconnected from some of the consequences of innovation or lack thereof, but it's much different than it was in feudal relations. The mechanism for this change is often referred to as the scientific revolution, but many of the assumptions of this part of history ought to be challenged. Let's start with its relationship to capitalism. Many textbooks will present the emergence of capitalism in the same place and time and century as the scientific revolution as coincidental, or they'll omit any relationship at all. But here's how Clifford Connor, a historian specializing in how class relations affect science and technology, described the rise of capitalism as it relates to science. Quote, the traditional ruling classes in Europe proved unable to stifle the growth of a social class that created immense wealth and fostered the development of new sailing and military technology, allowing Europeans to dominate world trade. At the same time, the rise of capitalism enabled social preconditions for a scientific revolution and promoted empirical methods of gaining knowledge of nature. So, increased trade gave more opportunities for illustrations of new technology through direct contact, at the same time as the rise of a class filled with people whose social status and standard of living depended on their ability to recognize and utilize new innovations. But where did these innovations come from? Was profit really the motivator in humanity making these discoveries? No. The profit motive certainly forced the ruling classes to take note of and integrate these innovations into society, as well as encouraging the transatlantic trade, which helped transmit information on a global scale. But they almost universally are innovations that the working class or working classes had already been aware of, often for centuries. Let's take the poster child for the scientific revolution, Francis Bacon. He's often attributed with bringing science away from the deductive reasoning that dominated ruling class scholastics since Aristotle and towards inductive reasoning that relied on empiricism and observing things that could be reproduced. However, Bacon's observations and inspirations came almost universally from the so called uneducated laborers and manual workers in his society. Sailing, mining, smithing, metallurgy, foundry operation, clockmaking, and glass blowing are just a sampling of the knowledge bases that had grown through experimentation centuries and millennia before the great men figures of the scientific revolution began to codify them for the new ruling class. Bacon postulates how his ideal institution of scientific discovery would look in his novel New Atlantis. In this work of utopian science fiction, Bacon imagines an association devoted to accumulating new empirical knowledge. He details how it would be organized, with the lower classes conducting the experiments and gentry and aristocrats consolidating the data and, in his words, acting as, quote, interpreters of nature. Robert Boyle is another figure of the scientific revolution, known as the father of modern chemistry. He acknowledged without compunction that most of his knowledge and his empirical processes were taken directly from the working class. In his own words, I freely confess that I've learned more of the kinds, distinctions, properties, and consequently of the nature of stones by conversing with 2 or 3 stonemasons and stonecutters than I ever did from Pliny or Aristotle and his commentators. He who scorns to converse even with mean persons does not deserve the knowledge of nature. Men from whom natural history must be learned are illiterate mechanics. There are too many other examples to fully go into detail. Tycho Brahe, known for codifying knowledge of astronomy, largely didn't make any observations himself. He merely patronized the nearly 200 peasant astronomers who did, and even that was with funding provided to him by a king. Rene Descartes, the thinker responsible for the Cartesian plane and significant advances in algebra and geometry, credits craftswomen, particularly weavers and embroiderers, as the most significant contributors to mathematical advances made through observation. So we see the initial effect of capitalism on innovation. It introduced empiricism into the echelon of society in control of large scale decisions. This new ruling class, however, had interests that were in irreconcilable conflict with the class upon whose labor they exploited. This led to a trend of innovations that continue to this day. Innovations that apply knowledge not to increase the efficiency of production, but to increase the control of investors over workers. The Cyrus McCormick Reaper Factory is a good example. Folks might recognize the name from the infamous Haymarket affair, where police fired into a crowd of protesters who were striking for the 8-hour workday. It was the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company that they were striking against. Murderous cops weren't the only solution to worker organizing that McCormick tried, though. In the 1880s, McCormick replaced his metal casting machines with new ones that cost more to buy, cost more to operate, produced inferior castings, and took longer to produce each casting. Why then were the casting machines replaced? It took less training to operate. This proved to be as effective as police violence at union busting. 3 years later, the union was gone and the machines were removed, the old ones reinstalled. McCormick produced a sort of de innovation. Everything was worse, but it gave capitalists more control over the workers they employed. This would emerge as a pattern, pervasive in capitalism, of de innovations that increase investor control of society. The digital age is king of these sorts of creative ways to make the world worse in order to keep control in the hands of the owning classes. From software like Photoshop moving towards an online only software as a service model, to digital rights management creating artificial scarcity in information, to chemicals added to pharmaceuticals to refresh or evergreen their patents, to grocery stores scaling back their employees in favor of self checkout lines, we see example after example of new and exciting innovations used to craft a dystopian hellscape. Take the case of Rita Leggett, who had severe chronic epilepsy from the age of 3. Medication was ineffective, and the seizures were getting worse and worse. So, in desperation, she volunteered for a human trial of a new technology called a BCI, or brain computer interface, meant to reduce her seizures. Now, despite what every piece of science fiction on the subject ever has led me to believe, she did not start a cyber zombie apocalypse or get a strange urge to start killing all humans. Instead, she just got a new life. Free of her seizures for the first time in her 49 years of life, she could go to the grocery store alone. She could take a walk by herself or just get in the car and go for a drive on a whim. If it ended there, it would have been a brilliant success. Unfortunately, the company that had patented her BCI, NeuroVista, ran out of money and went bankrupt. Of course, they sold off their patents, which now sit idle until someone can figure out a way to make them profitable. Since the trial was over and no one had the property rights to offer anymore, Rita and many others underwent what is clinically referred to as forcible explantation. Rita tried to mortgage her house to raise the money to keep the implant, but was unsuccessful. Quote, I wish I could have kept it. I would have done anything to keep it. I have never again felt as safe and as secure, nor am I the happy, outgoing, confident woman I was. This is innovation under capitalism. Automation technology also sees an emphasis under capitalism, particularly in the areas of manufacturing and information. The automation takes on a perverse role under capitalism. Rather than making the act of working less taxing, rather than making the tasks necessary to survive easier to accomplish, it actually seems to make work more tedious. It impoverishes workers that are replaced by the automation and leaves all of the gains in the hands of the investors. Of course, like many features of capitalism, this is highly contradictory. While the investors reap the benefits of automation, concentrating the work into fewer workers gives them more control, assuming they organize to exercise it. Much more has been said about capitalism and automation by more knowledgeable Marxists, including Marx, so I'll leave more on this subject to our discussion. So, if the profit motive is what drives capitalist innovation, does that mean we'll lose an innovative edge in a post-capitalist society? Of course not. Quite the opposite. If necessity is the mother of invention, then we can see why when workers are alienated from the results of their labor, they are less motivated to develop new and methods and tools. Even in the context of capitalism, we can identify something called the over-justification effect as a part of motivation crowding theory, giving external impetus for some actions, and for instance, paying money to do a job, can at times reduce the internal motivation to do that job. As far as a post-capitalist society, we can already demonstrate that the advantages that cooperative and collaborative research and development have over research being siloed and exclusive. Even capitalists acknowledge it. Look at how new gadgets are developed. Apple didn't invent GPS, voice recognition, and touchscreens. Even the internet and the protocols associated with it were all created with government funding and public universities. It's true that the capitalists took these, consolidated them, slapped a coat of paint on them, and sold it, but that doesn't change the origin of the ideas and the inventions, and the fact that they had nothing to do with market competition and everything to do with public consumption or cooperation. Excuse me. We can conclude then that technology will continue to be developed, but it's impossible to say exactly what innovation might look like after the revolution. We can point to some socialist projects and their technological advancements for an inkling, but not only is the landscape of discovery much different today, those socialist projects themselves had class relations interfere with discovery in science. For instance, the USSR rejected the concept of inherited genetics in favor of the theories of Trofim Lysenko, who believed that genetics were determined by circumstance and other external factors. Long after Lysenkoism had been proven to be a pseudoscience that in no way reflected reality, it was still the mandated dogma of the USSR to the detriment of its workers. To be clear, there were also incredible advances in technology during this time, but the influence of people making decisions on behalf of workers from the top down, divorced entirely from the consequences of those decisions, was nevertheless present and active. So we might not know exactly what scientific advancement and technological development will look like after the ruling class has been replaced by democratic worker control, but we can say that it will be conducted by workers for the benefit of humanity and not hinge on the whim of investors and bureaucrats. We can assume it will save the effort we currently expend on manufacturing scarcity and spend it on manufacturing prosperity. And we can imagine that with our current understanding of ecology, it will help us live in concert with nature rather than at its expense. Of course, all of this is moot conjecture until we have the political power to attain it. That's why worker organizing is so important to the future of technology. Only by taking the reins of society can we finally achieve a modern application of science for the benefit of all rather than just a select few.